The fog that morning was like a slow-moving tide, rolling inland from the Willamette River and settling over the land like a burial shroud. It clung to the trees, swirled between fence posts, and softened the outlines of the forested valley. By noon, it still hadn't lifted. Smoke from cabin chimneys curled through it and disappeared. The muddy paths running between fields and homesteads seemed to dissolve into nowhere. A stranger might have mistaken the place for deserted. But beneath the fog, life stirred, though not for long. This was Champoeg, a small frontier settlement cradled in the green belly of Oregon country. Just a scattering of buildings, a ferry landing, and a granary perched at a bend in the river. It didn't look like the kind of place history would remember. And yet, for a brief and burning moment, this forgotten town helped shape the future of the entire Pacific Northwest. Then, just as quickly, it vanished. Champoeg didn't fall to fire or war. It wasn't destroyed in some famous battle or lost in the shuffle of westward expansion. It was washed away, quietly, completely, until almost nothing remained. What happened here, and what was lost, still lingers in the silence between trees and in the restless churn of the river. The town's story begins not with conquest, but with cohabitation. Long before the Americans came, this land was home to the Kalapuya people. They moved with the seasons, managing the valley with fire and trade and an understanding born of centuries rooted in place. Their villages lined the banks of the Willamette. They harvested camas bulbs in spring, smoked salmon in summer, and welcomed the rains of fall with prayer and preparation. They knew the river's moods. They respected its power. In the early 1800s, the fur trade brought change. French-Canadian trappers, most of them former employees of the Hudson's Bay Company, settled in the valley, drawn by its abundance. Many married Kalapuya women and planted roots that were both cultural and agricultural. Their cabins were modest, their lives hard. But they built something stable, even as the world around them shifted. They called the place Champoeg, pronounced Champoeg, a name derived from the Kalapuya word for the camas flower that blanketed the valley in blue every spring. By the 1830s, the settlement had grown into a small but steady community. It lacked formal streets or a central square, but it had the essentials: a blacksmith, a granary, a Catholic church, and a ferry across the river. There was no government, no sheriff, no flag above the rooftops. Life here was defined by cooperation and custom. Then came the Americans. Pioneer families began arriving by wagon in the late 1830s, spilling out of the Oregon Trail with hunger in their eyes and deeds in their hands. They saw the valley not as a home to be shared, but a territory to be claimed. They built schools, held Protestant services, and began forming committees to regulate land and resolve disputes. Tension simmered. The French Canadians were used to informal arrangements. The Americans wanted law and hierarchy, yet they lived side by side, often in peace, trading goods, plowing fields, and marrying into one another's families. But the question of who truly owned this place would not remain unanswered for long. In early 1843, a series of events forced the issue. A settler named Ewing Young died without a will, leaving behind a contested estate. There was no legal system to resolve it, no judge, no probate court. Then, livestock thefts and boundary disputes escalated. Something had to be done. A meeting was called. On May 2nd, 1843, over 100 settlers gathered in a field near Champoeg. The proposal was simple in wording, monumental in consequence. Should Oregon establish a provisional government? It was more than politics. It was a line in the soil. On one side stood the Americans, eager to formalize their presence and prepare the territory for annexation by the United States. On the other, the French Canadians, who feared that doing so would erase their culture, nullify their land claims, and force them into a system that didn't recognize their history. The vote was not cast in secret. It was done by standing, physically walking to one side of the clearing or the other. 50 stood for yes, 50 stood for number. 2 more men stepped forward and joined the yes side, 52 to 50. By the slimmest margin imaginable, the Oregon Provisional Government was born, right there in the fields of Champoeg. The first step toward statehood had been taken. It would not be the last. Champoeg, once a quiet river town, now stood at the center of Oregon's political future. For a time, the town thrived, modestly but meaningfully. In the years that followed, a circuit court was established. A school was built. The population grew as steamboats began running up and down the Willamette. The fertile soil brought wealth to farmers. Wheat, fruit, and livestock moved through Champoeg on their way to markets downstream. Still, the changes came with costs. As more Americans arrived, French-Canadian influence dwindled. The Catholic Church struggled to retain attendance. The old customs, feasts, dances, native languages faded into memory. The town was becoming something different, something less rooted in its past and more beholden to the future being imposed upon it. Then, in the winter of 1861, the rains came. They began in October, steady at first, then unrelenting. By November, the ground was saturated. Roads turned to rivers. The Willamette rose, then surged. Locals called it the worst flood they had ever seen. Some fled early, others waited. Most believed the town would survive, as it had so many times before. But this time, the river was not merciful. On December 2nd, the flood hit Champoeg with a violence that no one had imagined possible. The water didn't just rise, it swallowed. Buildings were lifted whole and swept away. The ferry snapped from its moorings and disappeared downstream. The granary collapsed, trees uprooted, livestock drowned in their pens. By morning, it was over. Champoeg had been reduced to debris. When the water receded, the survivors stood in stunned silence. The land they knew was unrecognizable. Streets were gone. The foundations of homes had been washed clean. Only fragments remained, warped lumber, broken fences, stone steps that led to nowhere. Most residents packed what little they had and left. A few tried to rebuild. They laid new beams, raised cabins, but the river had proven too unpredictable, too cruel. And the government that Champoeg had helped create had already moved on, to Salem, to Portland, to places the flood could not reach. Over the next decade, the town faded into nothing. Nature reclaimed the land. Grass grew over roads. Trees rose where walls had once stood. The cemetery, on higher ground, was all that remained. The story of Champoeg might have ended there, had it not been for the whispers. Old men remembered the vote. Children grew up hearing tales of the flood. Historians began piecing together the fragments, reading letters, tracing survey lines, mapping the course of a river that no longer followed its banks. In 1901, a small group erected a monument on what they believed to be the site of that pivotal 1843 vote. Over time, that monument grew into Champoeg State Heritage Area, a park, a museum, a memory. But the town is still gone. There are no preserved buildings, no standing cabins, no museum street reconstructions, just signs, plaques, paths that lead into quiet woods. And yet, if you walk alone along the river's edge, you can feel it. Not a haunting, not a ghost, a weight. The weight of a place that mattered, of decisions made in open air, of cultures that collided and mingled, of voices raised in debate and drowned in water. Champoeg wasn't erased in a day. It was taken slowly, by flood, by policy, by forgetting. But not completely. The vote held here shaped the destiny of the West. The people who lived here French-Canadian trappers, Kalapuya families, pioneer farmers helped forge the region's soul. And the land beneath your feet still remembers. You just have to listen. To the river, to the wind in the trees, to the silence between what was and what remains. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.